The next class of submarine started by the Japanese Navy was the 2,564 surfaced and 3,644 submerged ton I-52 class, also known as the Hei-Gata C3 type, or just the C3 type, built between March 1942 and April 1944. These three were a continuation of the I-46 class. I can't say evolution because they were theoretically inferior. They had two less torpedo tubes, which they tried to make up for by having another deck gun. They weren't as fast due to Japanese industry straining to put out quality diesels. They still had a long range though, so there was that. This was good because I-52 was tasked with making a blockade run to France. The bad news is, remember when I said I-8 was the only one to succeed in making the round trip? Yeah. The standout was probably I-53. Having been converted into a chitin carrier, she managed, well, her chitin managed, to sink the destroyer escort Underhill. Ah, the chitin. Okay, let's do this. You know, there are many ways to kill yourself. A gun, pills, jumping in front of a car, closing the garage door, a plastic bag, leaping from a building. I could go on. There aren't many as sloppy as a chitin, though. There were several types of chitin, but only the Type 1 saw any action. It was basically a long-lance torpedo with an amped-up 1,550 kilogram warhead that had a pilot's cabin fitted between the warhead and the engine. The pilot had a tiny periscope to look through, so had to stay practically on the surface anyway. On the approach, he ran at about 20 knots and could slightly maneuver. Once the target was chosen, he could kick it up to 40 knots, but lost maneuverability. In some versions, the pilot could board the chitin while the submarine was submerged through a hatch in the bottom. Needless to say, once you got in, you didn't get out. Once in, the pilot got only a canvas seat. On the other hand, I guess at that point, it's probably too late to sit back and reevaluate your priorities in life. Steering was by a stick. This was good because a disproportionate number of chitin drivers were aspiring aviators, not submariners. The warhead was contact detonated, but had a backup manual switch. Just to make it more uncomfortable, quality control on the chitin wasn't the best. They often leaked, so the pilot had to find a target before he drowned in his own suicide weapon, or the water hit something and blew him up. I get the underlying issue of, by this point in the war, it was probably suicide to attack an American force anyway, so you might as well get something for it. But, geez, guys. It really is astonishing how quickly and fervently an entire nation embraced the idea of industrialized suicide. There were, of course, the kamikaze, the oka, the chitin, the kairyu, the shinyo, the suicide divers, and the list goes on. It's like they were trying to think of the most harebrained way to do it with the most unlikely success rate. Like I said, there are many easier ways to kill yourself. You know, sometimes I wonder if they actually wanted to take anyone out or if they just wanted to die honorably. Is that a legitimate question? Anyway, I-52 was started March 18, 1942 and completed December 28, 1943. I-53 was started May 15, 1942 and completed February 15, 1944. I-55 was started June 15, 1942 and completed April 20, 1944. Main armament was 6 bow 533 mm tubes for 19 torpedoes. 2 open 140 mm deck guns were mounted, one forward of the sail and one behind. Propulsion on the surface was provided by 2 diesel engines which produced 4,700 horsepower that ran the 2 propellers and recharged the batteries for a surface speed of 17 knots. While submerged, they used the batteries to power two motors which produced 1,200 horsepower for a top speed of 6 knots. Range on the surface was 21,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, and submerged they could do 105 nautical miles at 3 knots. Test diving depth was 100 meters. In February 1944, I-52 had her aft deck gun removed and was fitted with Type 22 radar. While working up in late February 1944, I-53 was fitted with Types 13 and 22 radar. In late August 1944, I-53 began conversion into a chitin carrier. Her aft gun was removed and attachments were added for 4 chitin. While undergoing repairs from April to June 1945, I-53 was further converted. Her forward gun was replaced with handling for 2 more chitin. Underwater boarding hatches were added for all 6 chitin, and a snorkel was fitted. I-52 left Japan on March 10, 1944 for Lorient, France via the Cape of Good Hope. On board were 2 tons of gold and 14 engineers intent on studying German anti-aircraft directors and engines. Awaiting her arrival at Lorient for the return trip were G7 homing torpedoes, an FW-190 engine, radars, bomb sights, and half a ton of uranium oxide. On March 21st, she arrived at Singapore, where she picked up 120 tons of tin, 113 tons of tungsten, 54 tons of rubber, over 3 tons of quinine, almost 3 tons of opium, and 58 kilograms of caffeine. In mid-May, she entered the Atlantic. On June 4, 1944, she crossed the equator. West of Cape Verde in the final hour of June 23rd, having been alerted by crypto, she was detected by an Avenger from the escort carrier Bogue, which tracked her by sonobuoys and damaged her with a Fido homing torpedo. A couple hours later, now the 24th, another Avenger from Bogue used the sonobuoy-Fido combination to finish her off. I-53 finished work up in mid-May 1944 and headed south. Unfortunately, it was found her fuel tanks were leaking, so she had to head back to Japan for more yard work, arriving in late July. While there, she started conversion into a chitin carrier. The work, though, was interrupted in mid-October 1944 when the U.S. landed at Leyte, and she was sent to patrol east of the island. East of Manila on November 4th, she was detected by the destroyers Boyd and Brown and barely escaped back to Japan to complete her conversion. At the end of December 1944, she was sent out on her first mission as a chitin carrier. Destination, the U.S. anchorage at Palau. Arriving on January 12, 1945, she launched all 4 chitin, and it was a complete flop. One exploded right after launch, another gassed its own pilot and never got off the deck, and the 2 that did launch blew themselves up without hitting anything. Having completely failed, she returned to Japan at the end of the month. While training off Sao Nada on March 30th, 1945, she hit an airdrop magnetic mine, badly damaging her. With repairs and further conversion complete, in mid-July, she was sent out to patrol northeast of Cape Engano in the Philippines. While there, on July 24th, she sighted a convoy leaving the Philippines for Okinawa and launched one of her chitin, which actually managed to sink the destroyer escort Underhill. On August 7th, while in the same area, she was detected by the escort destroyer Earl V. Johnson and badly damaged by depth charges and Hedgehog, sending her back to Japan. Post-war, she was scuttled as part of Operation Road's End. I-55 completed post-commissioning workup at the start of July 1944 and was ordered to run supplies to the troops on Guam. While underway, this mission was aborted and she was instead tasked with evacuating the staff from Tinian. Off Saipan on the morning of July 14, 1944, she was detected and sunk by the destroyer escort William C. Miller.